Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. Topic of conversation today is aligning IT and OT for truly effective risk mitigation. I'm delighted to welcome to the virtual studio Dave Cullen. He's Field CTO with OTORIO. Dave, thanks so much for taking time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be here.
Dave, I wonder if you might talk specifically about how the OT threat landscape in particular has evolved over the past couple of years, 2.5 years, and how and why it's become so much more dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is really this awareness. Now, I think it's always been there. There's been a push to automate, to have more data, to use analytics, to focus on efficiency. Many great factors to improve the efficiency of our critical environments and utilize data and whatnot. But in the last 2.5 years, external factors such as pandemic and whatnot, we've seen that really be a catalyst to speed that up. Typically, OT is very slow, conservative, and takes practical steps forward. And suddenly we have these catalysts that really have sped this up. And out of necessity, a lot of organizations have digitized, and they had to digitize fast, and yet had some amazing success. And I think really that has shown what we can do with innovation in these environments, and really be able to change the face of them. Now, with that comes risk. And we've connected things. We have data moving between environments, OT, IT, and really the old mentality, or perhaps the legacy approach, air gaps, physical separation, become much less feasible in today's world. And we've been talking about this for a while now, but what we've seen is, sort of putting some gas on the fire. It really has really accelerated. And then along with that, I think the threats that have the ability to impact the OT environment have matured, have become much more prevalent, and we're much more, aware that these threats exist, because we're seeing real examples of threats migrating and having an impact on OT.
Dave, you mentioned the old mentality, and as you know, there has been a traditional cultural gap between the IT and the OT groups. How and why do you find these threats exacerbated by this traditional gap?
Well, I think there's the issue with priorities, and we need to, they are different, but sometimes those don't get brought out into the open to look for unifying language and what have you, right? So the cultural gap, and really having a distinct understanding of what's your key priorities, especially in OT, because it does drive a different way of operating. Safety is job one. And then we also need to keep reliability and productivity in check. And those are really, there's a lot of rooted experience and collective knowledge that have built environments that are very safe, very reliable. And sometimes it seems obvious, seems simple, but the amount of work that's gone into that over the years to have this level of safety in these types of potentially dangerous environments, often gets understated, I find. And that can create this gap, because, OT needs to be commended for that. And really, the perception might be different. Now, IT has a lot of best practice as well. And yet some of those best practices don't translate naturally into OT. And so I think it really creates this gap that needs a creative solution.
Dave, you talked about the manifestation of specific threats. What risks do you find that they pose both to business continuity and to supply chain security, which we're talking about increasingly today?
Well, I think, with those risks, we have, with the push to automate and the rate of change, right? We really have, these environments have become more dynamic than they ever have been. And I think, first of all, like you said, with business continuity, that becomes a new exercise. We now need to plan for, how do we have guarantee that we can keep these environments safe and running, even in the face of a threat, right? And so it's a new business continuity exercise to be able to say we have all this automation, but how do we have the assurance that we can isolate and we can keep running, right? Now, supply chain security, I think, plays into that as well, because this is an ever increasing vector that needs to be paid attention to. And really, I think the risk here is knowledge, right? And how do organizations gain the appropriate knowledge to inform their business continuity plans and be able to respond to incidents? But also, how do they gain the knowledge to be able to assess and govern their supply chain security? And I think it's still a big gap that collectively we're working on.
What's your advice, Dave, on how one goes about creating an orchestrated, holistic approach to both IT and OT security?
Well, I think you need to look at um, aligning people, process, and technology. So let's talk about the technology. If we focus on how do we provide OT security that meets, I guess, some of the best practice of IT security, yet can remain and have the appropriate context for OT. So what we need to be able to do is integrate into the existing security solutions, right? In other words, be able to gain context from what's around the OT environment, what's around your most critical assets. Be able to have these different views to really see how everything's interacting and what influences are there. But then also be able to present the information to the appropriate personas, right? So there's many different personas that are now responsible for risk in these environments, and it's holistic, right? Like you said, the holistic approach is acknowledging that when we look at risk, we need to look at IT and OT security together. So how do we bring that information and be able to deliver contextual information to each of the personas that are involved in protecting these environments?
So to double click on that, what does orchestrated and holistic even look like? In other words, what are the tools and how do they improve detection and response?
Right. Well, I think again, it's to ensure the tools that are chosen don't create these different islands of information. Right. Sometimes we do that where IT has their own stack, OT has their own stack. And really, in some contexts, that's still needed. But in the security context, we need to integrate in. So should we be able to have an awareness of what's happening with both the perimeter firewall and OT firewall, EDR, security policies, Active Directory, all these different technologies that, believe it or sometimes we wouldn't expect to have touch points to OT, but they definitely do these in the modern kind of architecture. So what we need is really to be able to ingest information from all these systems, because when it comes to detection and response in OT, we want the confidence that if we detect a threat, it's real, and we need the ability to be able to orchestrate the response. So the response mechanism, I think we sometimes don't pay enough attention to this, is that it's different in OT. You can't just contain a device and take it offline. That might have serious and potentially life-threatening impact if you respond that way. So how do we, again, orchestrate with the existing solutions, but then be able to provide, kind of feasible mitigation steps and appropriate response that has the OT context? And I think, it's easier said than done.
Of course. So within the orchestrated approach, how does one also bridge, as we talked about, that historic cultural gap between IT and OT?
Well, I think you need to look for a unifying language, first of all, right? And to us, and for my belief, is start with risk, right? So risk has the ability to unify the approach, if you will, because it remains agnostic to the steps you take to mitigate the risk. But an important question we often ask is who owns the risk in the organization, right? So if an incident was to occur in the OT environment, who owns that risk? And oftentimes that's not even defined. And so that's where you can start defining that and really looking into the different personas that are involved. Sometimes we think we know, but until we take that objective look at it and actually start identifying it and putting it into an appropriate plan, policy, procedure, we don't really know. So there's all these different personas that we need to bring to the table. And then I think the next step really is training and awareness. Now, training, build that discipline up, and capability internally, but awareness can be driven from your technology, right? It is if you again have technology that can provide the appropriate contextualized information for your persona, I think that has the natural effect and the ability to bring people together. And what we need to do, and there's other things that can be commonalities like compliance and a lot of that kind of best practice. But we need to get to that point where we're sharing the best practices of each respective discipline and looking for those common language. And again, I think risk really is a great umbrella that brings that all together.
Dave, bringing it back to Otorio, how are you helping your customers to align IT and OT in a way that does mitigate business risk?
How we focus on this editorial through our solutions is to provide the ability, no matter what maturity level you're at, if you're just starting on your journey to securing your OT environment and are focused on gaining visibility into what you have, up to you've been through the previous generations of solutions and we're really starting to mature the OT security program and bring things into a repeatable and measurable kind of mode. Our solutions are built to meet you kind of where you're at and help that progression, right? And again, we focus on applying a risk-based approach to OT security. We're going to integrate with the existing solutions in the environment, and the more integration, the better, because the more context we gain, we can correlate information. We can really analyze what's going on around the environment and what impacts the OT environment, as well as what's in the environment. And what we seek to do is, again, no matter what step, which solution, is extend beyond indicators of compromise. Those are important. It's good to, you need to be aware of threats and artifacts that might exist in the environment that speak to or point towards compromise. But beyond that, considering the critical nature of these environments, we want to focus on indicators of exposure. How can we better protect these environments? How can we improve the architecture and design? And really that ties directly back into risk. So if we use risk as the umbrella and drive, here's our key actions, feasible steps that we can take to reduce risk in these environments, I think that's what we need to aspire to. And that's definitely what our solutions focus on.
Oh, terrific insights, Dave. I appreciate you taking time to speak with me today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
Again, the topic has been aligning IT and OT for truly effective risk mitigation. You've just heard from Dave Cullen, his field CTO with OTORIO. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you, as always, for your time and attention today.